I'm sorry for ruining Christmas by having cancer. The words tumbled out of my mouth automatically as my family sat in stony silence around the dinner table, angry that my chemotherapy schedule had forced us to postpone our traditional December 25th gathering to the 27th. That's when I heard it, really heard myself, apologizing for having a life-threatening illness because it inconvenienced others, and I wondered, when exactly had I become someone who apologized for existing? The cancer wasn't even the worst thing I'd apologized for that year. I'd said sorry for getting promoted, it made my siblings feel bad, sorry for my miscarriage, it upset my mother who wanted grandchildren, sorry for my divorce, it embarrassed my father at church, sorry for buying a house, it was showing off, sorry for losing weight, made my sister self-conscious, sorry for gaining it back, disappointed my mother, sorry for everything and nothing. Until the words, I'm sorry, became as reflexive as breathing. My name is Veronica Chen, and I spent 35 years apologizing for other people's emotions, reactions, and disappointments. Not because I'd done anything wrong, but because somewhere along the line, I'd learned that taking blame was the price of keeping peace, that saying sorry was safer than standing firm, that being wrong was better than being alone. It started early, in a household where emotional explosions were as common as morning coffee. My mother, a woman who could find fault in a rainbow, wielded guilt like a surgeon's scalpel, precise, cutting, and always leaving scars. My father, conflict avoidant to the point of invisibility, taught by example that the way to survive her storms was to apologize first and figure out what you'd done wrong later. Say sorry to your mother, he'd hiss whenever her mood darkened, regardless of the cause. For what? I'd ask, genuinely confused. Doesn't matter. Just apologize. So I did. I apologized for laughing too loud, for reading instead of socializing, for getting A's that made my B-student brother feel inferior, for having friends she didn't approve of, for not having enough friends, for existing in ways that triggered her inexplicable rage. I became a professional apologizer, an expert at diffusing situations by taking responsibility for things beyond my control. I'm sorry the rain ruined your garden party, Mom. I'm sorry Dad had to work late on your birthday. I'm sorry the grocery store was out of your favorite yogurt. I'm sorry you're having a bad day. She never said it was ridiculous to apologize for weather or other people's choices or yogurt availability. Instead, she'd nod, accepting these offerings like a deity accepting sacrifices, temporarily appeased until the next thing went wrong and the cycle repeated. My siblings learned different lessons. My older brother Keith discovered anger was his shield. If he yelled loud enough, Mom backed down. My younger sister Melissa perfected the art of invisibility, becoming so quiet and small that Mom's radar rarely found her. But I, the middle child, the peacekeeper, the one who couldn't bear tension, I learned to apologize. By high school, it was pathological. I apologized to teachers for asking questions, sorry, this might be stupid, but, to friends for having opinions, sorry if this sounds weird, but I think, to boyfriends for having needs, sorry to bother you, but could we maybe? I prefaced every thought with an apology, ended every request with sorry, existed in a constant state of preemptive contrition for crimes I hadn't committed. Why do you always say sorry? My best friend Andrea asked junior year. You literally just apologized for sneezing. Sorry, I said automatically, then laughed at the irony. But her question haunted me. Why did I always say sorry? College provided temporary relief. Away from home, I experienced days without apology, glimpsed what it felt like to exist without constantly atoning. But holidays and breaks meant returning to the familiar dance, Mom's moods, Dad's whispered warnings, my automatic I'm sorry for everything from my major choice, psychology, too depressing, to my hairstyle, too short, unfeminine. I married David partly because he seemed like the opposite of my chaotic childhood. Calm, steady, rational. What I didn't recognize was that his calm came from a similar place as my apologies, avoiding conflict at all costs. Together, we built a relationship on tiptoeing around issues, me apologizing for having feelings, him withdrawing whenever things got complicated. I'm sorry for crying, I'd say after miscarrying our first pregnancy. It's fine, he'd reply, already edging toward the door, uncomfortable with any emotion that couldn't be fixed with logic. I'm sorry for being difficult, I'd whisper after asking for more emotional support. You're not difficult, he'd say, but his actions suggested otherwise, working later, traveling more, being anywhere but present with my messy human needs. The marriage lasted 7 years, dying not from any dramatic betrayal but from the slow suffocation of two people who couldn't be real with each other. When I finally asked for a divorce, my first words were, I'm sorry, but I think we need to separate. Even ending my marriage required an apology. The divorce triggered my family's disapproval, not because they liked David particularly, but because divorce was failure, and failure reflected poorly on them. My mother's response was typical, I just don't understand how you could do this to us. I'm sorry, I said reflexively, then caught myself. Wait, what am I apologizing for? My marriage ending? For the embarrassment. For what people will say. For ruining Christmas. It was May. But in her mind, every future holiday was now tainted by my selfishness in choosing happiness over suffering quietly. That's when therapy started, with Dr. Martinez, who had a gift for cutting through BS with surgical precision. Let's track your apologies, she suggested. For 1 week, write down every time you say sorry and what for. The list was staggering. I apologized to the barista for ordering a complicated drink. To my coworker for having an idea in a meeting. To the grocery clerk for using exact change. To my apartment neighbor for existing in the hallway at the same time. To telemarketers for not being interested. To furniture for bumping into it. I apologized to a chair, I told Dr. Martinez, laughing and crying simultaneously. A chair? What would happen if you stopped? She asked. The question terrified me. People would be angry. They'd think I was rude, selfish, difficult. And then? They'd leave, I whispered, naming the fear that drove every unnecessary apology. Everyone would leave. But here's what I discovered, the people who required constant apologies from me were already leaving, just slowly. My mother only called when she needed someone to blame. My siblings maintained distance unless they needed something. Friends who expected me to apologize for having boundaries weren't really friends. I was hemorrhaging apologies to keep people who only valued me as a receptacle for their displaced responsibility. The cancer diagnosis came 2 years post-divorce, a routine mammogram turned nightmare. Breast cancer, stage 2, treatable but requiring aggressive intervention. Surgery, chemotherapy, radiation, the works. You'd think facing mortality would cure someone of unnecessary apologies. Instead, it initially made them worse. I'm sorry for needing rides to chemo. I'm sorry my surgery is during your busy season at work. I'm sorry I can't eat the food you made, the nausea. I'm sorry I look sick. I'm sorry this is hard for you. That last one, apologizing to others for how my cancer affected them, was peak dysfunction. But it was also familiar. I'd spent a lifetime managing other people's emotions about my life. The Christmas incident happened 3 months into treatment. My family insisted on maintaining our traditional December 25th gathering, despite my oncologist recommending I avoid large groups during chemo. When I suggested moving it to the 27th when my immune system would be slightly stronger, you'd have thought I'd suggested canceling Christmas forever. This is so typical, my mother fumed. Everything always has to revolve around Veronica. She has cancer, Keith pointed out, in a rare moment of defense. We all have problems, Mom snapped. But we don't make everyone else suffer for them. That's when it happened, sitting at the rescheduled dinner exhausted from treatment wearing a wig that itched forcing down food that tasted like metal listening to passive-aggressive comments about the inconvenience of moving Christmas 2 days, I heard myself apologize for having cancer. The words hung in the air like a neon sign of dysfunction. Even my family seemed momentarily stunned. In the silence that followed, something shifted inside me. A tectonic plate of people-pleasing finally cracking under the absurdity of apologizing for fighting to live. Actually, I said, my voice stronger, I'm not sorry. I'm not sorry I have cancer. I'm not sorry my treatment schedule inconvenienced you. I'm not sorry for prioritizing my health over your traditions. I'm not sorry for any of it. Veronica, my father started, his tone warning. No, I interrupted. I'm done. I've apologized my whole life for things that weren't my fault, weren't my responsibility, weren't even real. I've said sorry for existing in ways that made others uncomfortable, for having needs, for being human. But I'm not sorry anymore. You're being dramatic, my mother said, her go-to dismissal. Maybe. But I'm not sorry for that either. I left early, driving home through empty streets, feeling something I couldn't immediately identify. It took miles to recognize it, freedom. The terrifying, exhilarating freedom of not taking responsibility for other people's emotions. The family fallout was swift and predictable. I was selfish, changed, not herself since the cancer. They talked about me like the disease had affected my personality rather than revealed it. Maybe they were right, facing mortality has a way of clarifying what matters, and exhausting yourself managing other people's feelings about your life-threatening illness didn't make the list. But here's what surprised me, not everyone left. Andrea, my high school friend who'd questioned my apologies years ago, became my fierce advocate. Finally, she said when I told her about Christmas. I've been waiting 20 years for you to stop saying sorry for breathing. My coworkers, freed from my constant apologies, actually seemed to respect me more. Ideas presented without, sorry if this is stupid, carried more weight. Requests made without preemptive apologies were taken seriously. Who knew confidence could be as simple as not undermining yourself with unnecessary contrition? Even some family relationships improved. Keith started calling regularly, our conversations more honest without my constant apologizing. You know, he said during one call, I used to think you were weak, always saying sorry. But now I realize that took a weird kind of strength, absorbing everyone's blame all the time. I couldn't have done it. I shouldn't have done it, I corrected. No, he agreed. But I'm glad you stopped. Melissa remained distant but sent a card during my radiation treatments. Inside, in her careful handwriting, I'm proud of you for standing up to Mom. I could never. It was the most honest communication we'd had in years. My parents took longer to adjust. Months of cold silence, missed calls, family events I wasn't invited to. The girl who'd apologized for everything had been easier to love, or at least easier to blame. This new version who took responsibility for her actual choices but not their feelings about them? She was harder to manipulate. The breakthrough came, ironically, through another apology, but one that actually needed saying. I'd borrowed and accidentally broken my mother's vintage serving dish, a genuine accident requiring genuine contrition. Mom, I'm sorry. I broke your grandmother's platter. I'll try to find a replacement or have it repaired. She stared at me, then at the broken pieces I'd brought in a box, then back at me. You're apologizing? Yes. I broke your dish. That's my fault, and I'm sorry. But, you don't apologize anymore. I don't apologize for things that aren't my fault, I corrected. This is my fault. See the difference? Something shifted in her expression, confusion, maybe a dawning understanding. Oh. We sat in silence, the broken dish between us like a metaphor for all the unnecessary apologies I'd offered over the years, all the blame I'd accepted for things as beyond my control as gravity. I suppose, she said slowly, some of those things weren't really your fault. Most of them weren't. She started, then stopped. Starting again, that must have been exhausting. It was the closest she'd ever come to acknowledging the dysfunction. Not an apology exactly, but a recognition. Progress comes in millimeters sometimes. Recovery, from cancer, from chronic apologizing, from a lifetime of taking undue responsibility, isn't linear. I still catch myself starting sentences with sorry and have to consciously rephrase. The urge to manage other people's emotions by taking blame remains strong, especially during conflict. But I've learned the difference between healthy accountability and pathological apologizing. I say sorry when I'm actually wrong, when I'm late, when I make mistakes, when I hurt someone through my actions or words. But I don't apologize for existing, for having needs, for other people's reactions to my boundaries, for things beyond my control, or for living a life that doesn't center everyone else's comfort. How do you know the difference? A woman in my cancer support group asked after I shared my story. Ask yourself, did I actually do something wrong? Or am I just trying to make someone else feel better about their own emotions? Am I taking responsibility for my actions or for someone else's reactions? Is this apology about accountability or about avoiding abandonment? She nodded, tears in her eyes. I apologized to my husband last week for my mastectomy scars making him uncomfortable. I'm sorry, I said, meaning it. You deserved better than that. Yeah, she said, straightening. I did. That's the thing about unnecessary apologies, they don't just exhaust the apologizer. They let others off the hook for their own discomfort, their own growth, their own emotional regulation. When I stopped apologizing for having cancer, my family had to confront their own selfishness. When I stopped apologizing for my divorce, people had to examine their own judgments. When I stopped apologizing for existing, others had to deal with their own issues about my existence. 5 years post-diagnosis, 3 years into recovery, both from cancer and compulsive apologizing, my life looks radically different. I'm in remission, grateful for every scan that comes back clear. I'm in a relationship with someone who finds my lack of unnecessary apologies refreshing rather than threatening. I have boundaries that protect my peace and relationships that survive them. My family dynamics have shifted too. Without me as the designated apologizer, they've had to develop new patterns. Sometimes it's messy, old habits die hard, and the urge to restore familiar dysfunction runs deep. But there's also more honesty, more genuine accountability, more real connection when apologies mean something instead of nothing. I'm proud of you, my mother said recently, after I'd given a presentation at a cancer survivor event she'd attended. Not just for beating cancer, but for becoming yourself. Thanks, Mom, I said, resisting the old urge to apologize for how long it took. Because here's what I've learned, apologies are powerful when genuine, destructive when compulsive. Taking responsibility for everyone else's emotions leaves no room for your own. The people who require your constant contrition don't love you, they love the convenience of you. And sometimes the most radical thing you can do is stop saying sorry and start saying no. I still have the broken serving dish, carefully glued back together but showing its cracks. My mother insisted I keep it after the repair shop said it couldn't be perfectly restored. It's still beautiful, she said. Just different now. Like me, I thought. Cracked in places, imperfectly mended, but somehow stronger for having been broken and rebuilt. No longer apologizing for the space I take up in the world, the air I breathe, the life I choose to live. My name is Veronica Chen. I'm a cancer survivor, a recovered chronic apologizer, a woman who learned the difference between accountability and self-erasure. I'm someone who says sorry when warranted and stands firm when not. I'm not sorry for sharing this story, for taking up space, for becoming who I am. And that absence of apology? That's the most honest thing I can offer.